Hello, thank you for inviting me to your Digital Humanities Colloquium. The original plan was that I would be a guest scholar in Cologne at this time and give the talk there. But I, as so many others in these times, have had to change plans, so I'm giving the talk from my home in Bergen, Norway. I've prepared this talk in cooperation with my good colleague and friend Michael Sperberg-McQueen, who is known for many of you as editor of the Text Encoding Initiative, co-author of XML. As for me, I'm a philosopher and worked in humanities computing for many years. I was founding editor of the critical electronic edition of Wittgenstein Nachlass, which was published in 2000. So the talk we prepared for you is on document similarity. And first, I'll begin by talking a little bit back and forth about document similarity in general, then introduce you to what is our vantage point in our approach to questions of document similarity, namely that of transcription, and then finally on some quantitative measures of document similarity. So, document similarity seems to be a very popular theme these days. Every conference I go to, there are many talks on document similarity, very much interesting, explorative work going on. And one of the things one sometimes hears is statements such as document A scores 0.89 on similarity to document B, but only 0.62 to document C. 0.62 similar. What do such statements mean? What is that kind of information useful for? Well, in computer applications and development of computer applications, it's useful in context of document retrieval, in ranking of web hits, summarization tools, lots of interesting work in natural language processing. But we should remind ourselves that similarity is relevant and important in many other contexts. Digital document similarity is obviously important in library cataloging, in processes of document authentication, in work in archives, in cases of plagiarism. It comes up in discussions of documentary evidence in courts. It's important in administrative document management and in scholarly disciplines like stylometry or historical and literary studies. Issues of document similarity play important roles. Document similarity is also important in practical life, practical contexts. If document similarity fails, you may actually lose a contract or a job. You may be convicted of a crime. You may be denied access to a country. You may be accused of or even punished for plagiarism. Now, the similarity criteria in these contexts vary. Passports, for example, and other identity documents are considered so important that only very rarely can one replace them with similar documents, and in those cases, the similarity criteria will be very strict. But in other contexts, what is sometimes too little similarity is at other times too much. Consider a new reprint or edition of an earlier published book, for example, with if it contains differences, spelling errors, formatting errors, etc., compared to the original edition or publication, then if it's published with the original author's name on its sleeve, it will be considered a sloppy, a bad reprint. It is not entirely similar to the original. However, if it's published with another person's name on the sleeve, pretending to be the author of that same book, it will be considered blatant plagiarism. It's too similar. So in the one case, the same book is not similar enough, and in the other case, it's too similar. Now to transcription. As I said, that is our take or our vantage point for approaching issues of document similarity. And transcription may mean many different things. It may mean the writing of a musical score for another instrument. It's sometimes used to refer to the transfer of spoken utterances to writing. In genetics, it denotes the process of copying DNA to RNA in cells. But when we talk about transcription here, we mean the reproduction of a text of a particular document. It's an activity which is essential for critical or documentary editing, which is currently an important part of digital humanities, of course. Now, here's an example of a transcription. On the left, you see the original, what we call the exemplar, and on the right, the transcription. In this case, we're dealing with Herman Melville's notes in a Shakespeare volume, his handwritten notes in a printed edition of Shakespeare. The advantages of transcription is, first of all, transcriptions are easier to read than the original. I think you can agree that that holds in this case. Also, transcriptions save the originals of wear and tear, since scholars don't have to visit and consult the originals in the source libraries or archives. Transcriptions can easily be duplicated, and digital transcripts lend themselves to digital search and analysis, of course. So the transcript serves as a substitute for the exemplar. But of course, no reproduction can preserve all properties of the exemplar. On the other hand, the more of the information it preserves and the more accurately it does so, the more are the situations in which it can function as an acceptable substitute. And then you might think, well, what about high quality images, facsimiles, pictures, which are easy and cheap to produce nowadays? And if it's the linguistic content that you need to analyze and search in, what about optical character recognition? Well, let's have a look at this again. Uh, yes, what you see on the left is a digital facsimile. It is very hard to read. And the advantage of the transcript is that you don't need to be a Melville scholar. Even a Melville scholar will probably find the transcription easier to read than the original. And when it comes to OCR, well, OCR technology has made great progress and is making great progress these days, but the task of automatic recognition of that example on the left-hand side of this slide is probably too difficult still. Now, a few reflections on similarity and identity in general. Similarity is not a question of all or nothing. Similarity comes in degrees. It's sometimes said that one shouldn't or can't compare apples and pears, but of course one can. Apples and pears are similar sized, edible things that grow on trees. There are differences between them, of course. Even in the case of extremely different objects, we can always find some respect in which they are similar. A cat and a van, even a cat and a van, if you consider their colors. And then on the other extreme, consider two billiard balls. What could be more similar? Well, of course, when you look closer at things, you will always be able to find some kind of dissimilarity in weight or shape, or at least in their position in space and time. When we go to the philosophers and ask to be informed by their concept of similarity, it's a good thing to start with the concept of identity, the one extreme. And then we'll hear that a logical law, which is considered to capture the essence of identity, is the so-called indiscernibility of identicals. That is, if X is identical to Y, then X and Y share all properties. The opposite law is more debated, the so-called identity of indiscernibles. That is, if two objects share all the same properties, are they then necessarily identical? That's what Leibniz thought. Well, anyhow, on this concept of identity is never a matter of degree. If A is identical to B, A and B are different names for the same object. In the case of concrete objects, they share the same space-time regions. In the case of abstract objects, they share all predicates. In the case of sets, they have the same members. It's a so-called equivalence relation, reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. The snag is that it generates paradoxes. They don't need to concern us here, but if we go to the concept of similarity, which is similar to the identity concept, except that it is not transitive, that has been the central concept in epistemology and metaphysics up until at least the second half of the 20th century, and still is an important concept. Lately, however, it's fallen a little bit in disrepute because, as it says, any and all objects may be found similar or dissimilar in some respect. And in addition, the formal philosophical notion of similarity is riddled with some of the same kinds of paradoxes. Lately, however, Dubin and Decock has come up with a context-sensitive notion of similarity, or of context-sensitive similarity, which is the one we find most readily applicable to issues of document similarity, according to which similarity is always similarity in some respect. And that respect in which something is considered similar or not similar is determined by the context. And it may also involve some degree of vagueness or subjectivity. And then the same goes, mutatis mutandis, for identity. Now, there are many ways in which documents may be similar or dissimilar. They may be in the same or different languages, share vocabulary, same or different compositional, linguistic, rhetorical structure, theme, genre, style, plot, narrative, meter. Documents can be compared and found similar or dissimilar along all these dimensions, which is something which is often forgotten when one talks about document similarity in digital humanities contexts. Not always, but sometimes. There is a distinction between types and tokens, which is also important to our approach to these issues. And I'll try to explain that first by referring to a common distinction between documents and texts. It's often held that documents should be considered concrete physical objects in distinction to texts, which are abstract objects. And then one can claim that when documents are similar, it is because they instantiate the same text. So this distinction may actually be used as an account of document similarity. A concept of document similarity is, so to speak, baked into the distinction between the concrete physical object, and the abstract object. Now, one of the good things about abstraction is that it can take place at different levels, which is exploited by the functional requirement for bibliographic records, which is important in the bibliographic studies and the bibliographic profession. Ferber distinguishes between items, which are the lowest level of abstraction. An item is a physical object, and manifestations, which may roughly correspond to editions of a book, and the expression, which is the linguistic content of the book, of or of the work, which is the highest abstraction level. And the work may find its expression in different expressions, that is, in different languages, each of those in different editions, and each edition there will be many items. Now, there are two questions that have been raised concerning this distinction. First of all, many have seen a problem in the notion that we can interact with abstract objects. Abstract objects have no spatial or temporal properties. They are, so to speak, outside of space and time. And how can we interact with such objects? And then, on the opposite side, some people have been puzzled by observing that also documents seem to be abstractions in some sense or at some level. Well, our approach is a little bit different. Our departure point is Charles Sanders Peirce, the American philosopher's distinction between types and tokens. Peirce says famously somewhere that there is only one word, the, in the English language, but it occurs 14 times on this page. Well, it doesn't occur 14 times on this slide, but it did on the page where this statement was published. Well, anyhow, the idea is that there are many tokens, but only one type. So what's a token? A token is a mark. It's some perceivable pattern in the physical substrate. So take a manuscript. It contains letters and words, but it may also contain scratches and lines and dots and fly specks, which are not, so to speak, not part of the text. They are marks, but they are not tokens because they instantiate no type. They are not letters. It's also important that no token instantiates more than one type. A token is either the letter A, for example, or the letter B. There is nothing between. It may be uncertain whether it's an A or a B, but if we are uncertain, then we are at least certain that if we only could find out, we would learn whether it was an A or a B. It can't be 60% A and 40% B or something like that. It's also important that the way that tokens are defined, there is no need that tokens of the same type are visually or perceptibly similar. And if you take a look at the various typefaces and realization in handwriting of the same letters of the alphabet, you can readily assure yourself that it is very hard to find a common visual similarity between all the tokens of one type. We add something to Peirce distinction. We distinguish between simple types, typically letters of the alphabet, and composite types. And composite types are composed of simple types. So composite types will be things like words, sentences, paragraph, dictionary entries, composed, which may in turn be composed of other composite types. So composite types have structure. Back to transcription. We have proposed a notion of T-similarity for the similarity that holds between an exemplar and its transcription. Now, what we've already said about transcription suggests a common view of transcription, namely that by transcription we mean the effort to report, insofar as typography allows, precisely what the textual inscription of a manuscript consists of. This is a quote from Thomas Tencel, a famous textual scholar. That is, transcripts do not add or remove or reorder or correct or normalize the text of its exemplar. Sounds fair enough. But then we observe that often they do. Transcriptions may differ in their treatment of, for example, page numbers, whether they retain the page number of the original, for example. Same with line numbers, and they may add explanatory notes, which are not a transcription of anything in the exemplar. They may decide to include or not to include deletions, material in foreign hand. They may expand abbreviation or leave them as they are. They may take allograph variation, for example, between long and short s into consideration or not. They may silently or explicitly or not at all correct misspellings and slips of the pen. Yet that they differ, sorry, does not always mean that they disagree. Now, how can that be? Well, our definition of T-similarity is, on the outset, simple. If T is a transcript of E, then T and E are documents of the same type. More precisely and in more detail, T and E are T-similar if and only if there is a one-to-one relation between the tokens in E and the tokens in T. That is the rule of reciprocity. If every token in T transcribes something in E, that is the rule of purity. If every token in E is transcribed by something in T, that's the rule of completeness. And if corresponding tokens in E and T are of the same type, that's the rule of type similarity. So a transcription of an exemplar gives you the whole exemplar and nothing but the exemplar. Now, it's important that these rules are defeasible. And we believe that when in practice transcripts violate the rules of T-similarity, we think they do so, or we observe that they do so systematically. So we believe that we can account for variance in transcriptional practice as systematic exceptions from these rules. Therefore, we've called T-similarity the default transcriptional implicature. That is, the rules of T-similarity are so obvious, so simple, that they are usually not worth mentioning. Actually, it would often seem like an offense to the reader to explain that you have tried to follow these rules. Now, back to transcription. The same example, the Melville manuscript. That actually also exemplifies violations of the rules of T-similarity. For example, and I have put those exceptions in frames. For example, the exemplar obviously does not contain the headline notes in the Shakespeare volume on verse of last leaf of volume 7, page 524. That's an addition. So the transcript is not pure. And the transcript also contains line numbers in the left margin, which are obviously not there in the exemplar. It contains some angle brackets. They are meant to indicate deletions. And some of the words are printed in italics, which is an indication that they have been underscored in the exemplar. Now, to quantitative measures of similarity. In practice, when we set out to measure the similarity of digital documents, we use tools like Diff or other file comparison tools. We use tools which measure Levenstein distance or other edit distance measurements. We may use term frequency metrics and statistical methods. Are these methods actually all talking about the same kind of thing? Let's take Diff first. Diff is a line-based comparison tool. Given two digital documents, A and B, Diff ignores identical lines and displays lines which are only in A, lines which are only in B, and lines which contain differences. So there is an obvious similarity, here, to the notion of T-similarity. It turns on purity, completeness, and type identity. Levenstein distance is a method which counts the minimal number of primitive operations required to change one string to another. So, if no operations are required to change the one document to the other, the Levenstein distance is 0. That is, in this context, maximal similarity. The primitive operations available are strictly defined. They are 3: insertion, deletion, and substitution. And again, we may observe a similarity to T-similarity. The operations may be said to count the violations of the rules of purity, completeness, and type identity. Now, Levenstein distance recognizes types only on letter level. So notice that between the words Merkel 1, Merkel, 2, Merkle, and 3, Merksi, the Levenstein distance between 1 and 2 is the same as the Levenstein distance between 1 and 3. Intuitively, however, I think most of us would agree that 2 is somehow closer to 1 than 3, because all that's happened in 2 is that the two last letters of Merkel have been transposed, whereas in 3, both letters have been substituted by something else. And to reflect this, Damerow introduced a fourth primitive operation to the Levenstein distance measure, now called the Damerow-Levenstein distance. And the fourth primitive operation is transposition. Implicitly, this is a recognition that there may be also reason to consider similarities on a higher level than just individual letters. Now, the resemblance to T-similarity here is that, as you perhaps noticed, in our definition of T-similarity, we didn't say anything about sequences at all. We only talked about types, and types are structured. Sequencing is one way of structuring types. Now, these edit distance measures are intended for use on strings, that is sequences of letters, but they are also applicable to documents, but suitable mostly for similar documents or small documents where the distances will tend to be small. For example, revisions of a work um, by the same author. But these distance measures deal less well with larger documents and very different documents, and also deals badly with large transpositions. They have no awareness of higher level structured types. Now, in the absence of such awareness, one may go to the other extreme and disregard all structure, that is, if not all, then disregard even sequence. That is, to regard documents not as sequences, but as sets of words. Jaccard similarity is an example of this kind of approach. The Jaccard similarity measure is defined as the intersection over union. That is, for two documents A and B, count the number of words or word types occurring in both. That's the intersection. Occurring in at least one. That is the union. And divide the intersection by the union. The higher the score, which will be between 0 and 1, the higher the similarity. At least the higher the Jaccard similarity. Variations may be done to this approach. For example, one may decide to count not only the number of shared or unique words or word types, but also the number of times each of them occurs, that is the word tokens. That is, operate not on sets, but on bags of words. Bags or multisets are sets which, unlike ordinary sets, can have multiple copies of the same member, so to speak. This approach takes the frequency of words into account. Then one may go further. Substitute words of certain lexical forms with their stems or their lemma. One may also exclude some frequent function words, that is, operate with the stop word list, excluding in English words like the or a or that, which are so frequent that they are in some situations considered irrelevant. Now again, we may observe a certain similarity to T-similarity. We're still dealing with measures of purity and the completeness and type identity, but now as a relation between bags of strings or words. Distributional semantics. It's a large and interesting field in which a lot of interesting development is happening these days. It may be seen to take its departure point in the linguist Ferd's famous slogan, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps," which is maybe seen as an expression of the distributional hypothesis of meaning. That is, that words frequently occurring in similar contexts tend to have similar meanings. So the similarity in distributional lexical items is extended to similarity in distributional lexical items with similar meaning. But now, how do we come to grips with the notion of similarity of meaning? Well, it turns out that similarity of meaning in turn is measured by similarity of contexts in which the items occur, collocations. Um, there are many variations on distributional semantics and many approaches. Term weighting, mutual information, word embeddings, latent semantic indexing, and other techniques. We may ask whether they can all be viewed as attempts to give more weight to some substitutions among word tokens than to others. That is, we may ask, does the analogy with T-similarity still hold? We don't know, but we think it's worth exploring. Now, so far we talked about comparisons of sequences, sets, and bags of words. And there are zillions of sophisticated and useful ways of identifying and measuring document similarity out there. At least many of them can usefully be seen as turning on the T-similarity notions of purity, completeness, and type identity. But to our knowledge, all of them regard documents as sequences, sets, or bags of lexical items. That is, they do not take documents directly in the form of higher level types, into account. So what can we conclude from this? Well, digital humanists have insisted that documents cannot be exhaustively analyzed only as a sequence or bag of words. Documents of structure. Structure which is conveniently represented by markup and usually modeled as graphs, such as trees, tangled trees, directed acyclic graphs, region annotated sequences, general hypergraphs. So document graph similarity measures would be really nice to have. So there is work still to be done. Thank you.